Before we pull up the data, I want you to look out the window. Look at the city, the lights, the traffic, the constant hum of commerce. It feels permanent, doesn't it? Like a machine that runs on its own logic.
It feels chaotic, honestly, between the inflation reports and the geopolitical tension. It feels like the machine is sputtering, but I assume you are going to tell me that is just the result of bad policy.
I am going to tell you that policy is a fairy tale we tell ourselves to feel in control. We think the Federal Reserve sets the tempo for the global economy. We think interest rates and tax brackets are the levers that move the world. But that is a comforting fiction.
Comforting. It does not feel very comforting when the rates go up. But if it is not the Fed, and it is not the government who is driving the car,
that is the question. Imagine if I told you that the real driver sits 93 million miles away. Imagine if I told you that the volatility you feel in the market, and even the volatility you feel in your own mood, is just a downstream effect of a heartbeat that is much older than Wall Street.
You are starting to sound a bit esoteric. Are we talking about astrology? Because if this is a horoscope for the S&P 500, I am going to be very skeptical.
It is not astrology. It is history, and it is physics. We are about to look at a correlation that has held firm for over a century, linking the magnetic turbulence of a star to the unemployment lines of the G7 nations. It is a system that pulses, and right now, the pulse is accelerating.
Okay, that is a big claim, but I am listening. Show me the evidence.
Let's open the file. We begin with page 1.
The cosmic margin call. That is a heavy title. The image is striking. A Victorian banker fused with a burning sun, and a ticker tape of crashes.
This is where it starts. In the late 19th century, a British economist named William Stanley Jevons noticed something that unsettled him. He called it a beautiful coincidence.
What was the coincidence?
He tracked the cyclical crises of commerce, the booms, the busts, the panics. He found they occurred at intervals of roughly 10 to 11 years.
Which is a standard business cycle, right?
That is what we call it now. But Jevons noticed that this periodicity perfectly matched the solar cycle, the rhythmic waxing and waning of sunspots on the face of our star.
Sunspots. You are saying trade wars are caused by spots on the sun. That sounds impossible.
Jevons was ridiculed for it. They dismissed him as a crank. But look at the first bullet point. Solar maximums predict 8 of 13 recent USA recessions.
8 of 13. That is a statistically significant number.
It is a heartbeat. Since 1935, nearly every cyclical maximum of solar activity has overlapped closely with a recession in the United States. Even the Great Recession of 2008 and the crash of 1929 align with these cosmic breath cycles.
So when the sun gets active, the markets crash.
It is not just markets. Russian scientist Alexander Chizhevsky expanded on this. He mapped solar maximums to maximum excitability in the human population. Revolutions, wars, mass movements.
So the theory is that solar turbulence agitates us biologically, and that agitation breaks the economy.
Exactly. The sun flares, and down here, the markets burn. This isn't random. It is a cosmic margin call.
If this correlation is so strong, why isn't it on the front page of the Financial Times? Why does every economist I know talk about inflation targets and supply chains instead of sunspots?
Because admitting it would break the illusion of authority. Which brings us to page 2.
The blue pill illusion. I see a mannequin with a TV for a head in a boardroom. Rates stable.
This is the world you live in. the sanitized world of modern economics. Here, we are told that recessions are technical glitches or policy errors. We are told that with the right adjustments, we can engineer a soft landing.
And you are saying that is a lie.
I am saying it is a mask. Look at the data from before the Great Depression. Before 1933, the USA economy spent nearly 50% of its time in recession.
50%. That is incredibly unstable.
It was raw. It was exposed to the solar signal. After the Great Depression, the government built massive levees, stimulus packages, safety nets, heavy regulation. They did this to shorten the downturns.
Well, that sounds like a good thing. We stabilized the system.
We didn't stop the cycle. We just masked it. We suppressed the symptoms. Modern governance is essentially a bookkeeping trick to hide the fact that we are still tethered to that 11-year rhythm.
So the volatility is still there. It is just being suppressed by debt and printing money.
Precisely. The IMF and the World Bank act as if they control the tides, but they are just building sandcastles. They ignore the solar variable, because to acknowledge it would be to admit that the engine of our prosperity is entirely out of their hands.
That is a terrifying thought for a central banker, but I need more than just a correlation. Sunspots cause recessions is a big leap. What is the mechanism? How does a ball of gas 93 million miles away actually change the price of bread or the decision to sell a stock?
It is not magic. It is biology. Let's look at the hardware on page 3.
Biological and agricultural hardware. I see a human eye with glowing neural pathways and wheat.
Let's start with the eye, deep inside your retina. Separate from the rods and cones that give you vision, are ganglion cells containing a protein called melanopsin.
I have heard of this regarding sleep cycles.
Right. These cells are hardwired to the sun's blue light spectrum. They synchronize your hypothalamus and your circadian rhythms. When solar irradiance shifts, even by a fraction of a percent, it alters the spectral signal reaching your brain.
So we are physically tuning in to the star's frequency.
We are biological machines tuned to a variable star. But it is not just us. It is the food supply. Look at the bullet point about wheat prices.
Solar minimums correlate with 70% wheat price spikes. 70%.
That data comes from medieval England, from 1259 to 1703. The correlation is brutal. When the sun is quiet, a solar minimum, cosmic rays penetrate the atmosphere more easily. This alters cloud cover and stratospheric chemistry,
which changes the weather,
which destroys crop yields. The harvest fails, the price of bread spikes, and the economy collapses. The business cycle Jevons saw wasn't just psychology. It was the agricultural shockwave of a variable star.
Okay, that makes sense for an agrarian society in 1300. But we are not peasants farming wheat anymore. We have a digital, industrial economy. Surely we have outgrown this dependency.
We have traded one dependency for another. We traded solar calories for fossil fuels. But now, we are trying to go back, and that is where the physics trap snaps shut. Turn to page 4.
The energy return trap. This looks like a coal plant shrinking into a grid of solar panels. And the numbers, EROI 30, dropping to EROI 1.6.
This is where the software of our modern economy crashes into physics. Civilization runs on EROI, energy return on investment.
Explain that simply.
It is the profit margin of energy. If you spend 1 unit of energy to drill for oil, and you get 30 units of oil back, your EROI is 30. That surplus of 29 units is what builds universities, hospitals, and art. Modern society requires an ROI of 10 to 30 to function.
Okay, and fossil fuels give us that.
Fossil fuels and nuclear do. Nuclear can hit 70, but we are dismantling that infrastructure for the green transition. We are moving to solar photovoltaics.
Which is good for the climate, right?
It might be, but look at the energy math. In moderate climates like Germany or the USA, the ROI of solar PV drops to roughly 1.6.
1.6. That is barely breaking even.
Exactly. It is barely enough to sustain the energy system itself, let alone the rest of society. This isn't a transition. It is an energy sink. To get the same amount of reliable power, we have to triple the mineral demand by 2040.
7 tons of materials per terawatt hour for coal versus 120 tons for solar.
We are leveraging our debt to buy a lower standard of living. We are moving from high-density, high-return energy to low-density, mineral-intensive energy. And the market doesn't know how to price that decline.
This sounds like we are walking into a trap. If the energy return is so low, how do we manage it? How do we keep a complex society running on barely any energy profit?
We have to change how we govern. We have to look back at the people who mastered the sun before us. Move to page 5.
Source code, the divine administrator. This is a bust of Tutankhamun fused with, is that a Japanese bureaucrat?
It is. We often think of ancient sun worship as primitive superstition. It wasn't. It was administrative necessity. The pharaohs called themselves sons of Ra to maintain mad order.
Order against what?
Against the chaos of the solar cycle. The Egyptian economy was a centralized command system. The temple bureaucracy controlled the grain silos to buffer against the volatility of the Nile, which was driven by the sun.
So the sun god was basically a branding exercise for a centralized grain reserve.
Precisely. And Japan did the same thing. The Meiji state used Amaterasu, the sun goddess, to legitimize a hyper-centralized bureaucracy. They understood that, to survive the variability of nature, you need a monopoly on time and resources.
The slide mentions calendars as tools of political synchronization.
The Gregorian calendar, the imperial rescript, these were tools to align the legal body of the state with the physical body of the solar cycle. The source code of civilization is centralized control, justified by solar mythology, to manage the terror of starvation.
That sounds incredibly authoritarian. You are saying that to survive a volatile sun, you need a dictator, or at least a very strong central planner.
I am saying that low-margin environments demand strict control, which brings us to our current problem. We are trying to do the opposite. Page 6.
The glitch. Decentralized fragility. A pyramid crushing a solar panel. That is a violent image.
This is the glitch. We are attempting to build a decentralized, liberal, free market future on an energy platform that demands the rigid centralization of an ancient empire.
Because of the ROI problem we saw on slide 4.
And the intermittency. Solar and wind are intermittent. To run a grid with 90% renewables, you cannot rely on the free market. You need backup power, massive storage, and constant intervention to prevent blackouts.
Low ROI demands high centralization.
Exactly. You cannot have a low-density, mineral-intensive energy system without a command economy to manage the logistics, the mining, and the rationing.
So the idea of energy democracy, where everyone has a solar panel on their roof and we are all independent, that is a fantasy.
It is a fantasy that leads to grid failure. The physics contradicts the politics. We are walking into a trap where the only way to keep the lights on is to resurrect the political structures of the pharaohs. We are recreating the command economy out of necessity.
That is a bleak picture. We are trading efficiency for chains. And we are doing all of this while the sun itself is entering a volatile phase.
That is the convergence. That is what keeps me up at night. Let's look at the final slide. Page 7.
The horizon. Maximum excitability. A city at twilight, crowds gathering, and a red sine wave labeled Solar Cycle 25.
We are currently at the peak of Solar Cycle 25. If Chizhevsky was right, we are entering the phase of maximum excitability.
Which means revolution.
The data shows a terrifying convergence. Revolutions, mass migrations, and regime collapses cluster around these solar peaks. We are already seeing it. Riots, regime changes, war.
And the recession.
Historical patterns suggest the economic hammer drops 2 to 3 years after the solar maximum. That puts the G7 economies in the crosshairs for a major downturn in 2025 or 2026.
So we have a perfect storm. We have a fragile, low-energy return power grid. We have a population that is biologically agitated by solar radiation. And we have an economic cycle due for a crash.
Convergence of recession, unrest, and migration. It is all happening at once.
So, what is the solution? If we can't stop the sun, and we can't change the physics of solar panels, what do?
We synchronize. The slide says, the future is synchronized survival.
What does that mean, practically?
It means the era of the blue pill is over. The nations that survive will be the ones that accept the hidden structure. They will re-centralize control. They will lock down their resources. They will stop pretending the market is a free-floating entity and start managing it like a survival engine.
That sounds like the end of the world as we know it.
It is the end of the illusion. We are realizing that we are not the masters of the solar system. We are just passengers, and the ride is about to get very bumpy.
Well, I suppose I should cancel my stock trades and buy some copper.
I would say, buy a helmet.